テレ東ワールドポリティクス豊島晋作です。イスラエル軍とハマスの軍事衝突、いわゆるガザ戦争は一層激しさを増しています。イスラエルのネタニヤフ首相は戦争の第2段階に入ったとして地上作戦を拡大しています。このまま本格的な大規模地上侵攻となれば、すでに8000人を超えたとも言われるパレスチナ側の死者数はさらに増える可能性があります。このガザ戦争の今後のシナリオ、特に最悪のシナリオは一体何なのか。今回はアメリカの国家安全保障会議でアジア担当の大統領特別補佐官などの要職を歴任したマイケル・グリーン氏へのインタビューを通じてお伝えしていきます。グリーン氏は近年はライン・オブ・アドバンテージなど日米関係に関する書籍なども出版していて、アメリカ外交の裏表を知り尽くす人物です。今のアメリカがイスラエルに対してどういうことを考えているのか、そうしたアメリカの本音の部分、そしてイスラエル、そしてアメリカのですね、インテリジェンスの失敗などについても聞いています。ではインタビューをご覧ください。
Thank you very much for joining us here. Thank you very much. Thank you. Could I ask you about Hamas-Israeli warfare ongoing? So if the ground invasion were to begin, it will be very painful and it will be long. United States have a great lesson on the urban warfare in Fallujah or whatever in Iraq. Or how do you see this current situation? What could be next phase?
Well, there's no doubt the next phase is going to be more violent and will almost certainly involve urban warfare or ground troops in Gaza. And that's necessary because Israel was subjected, and innocent Israeli civilians were subjected to a brutal, unprovoked, and deliberate attack. And so Israel has not only the right to defend itself against such an attack, but really a responsibility, a moral responsibility to its people and to the world to eliminate as much of Hamas as possible. However, occupying Gaza would be an extremely difficult mission for the Israeli Defense Force and a bad idea. But Hamas uses hospitals and schools and civilian areas as protection so that if the Israelis attack, they can go on the media and say that Israel's in the wrong. So it's going to be hard, but the best case scenario is go in, eliminate 80-90% of Hamas's warfighting capability, get out, and then somehow the Arab League, Qatar, Egypt, and others support reconstruction. Perhaps Japan, the U.S. would help, and gets into Gaza an authority to rebuild and run the place. That's the best case scenario. But there are a lot of bad scenarios too. This could escalate. Already Hezbollah in the north is firing rockets into and invading with small units Israeli territory. And if Hezbollah comes in, and it expands, we could have a war between Iran and Israel. And that would be damaging for Israel, damaging for the Palestinian people, and it would also be really damaging for the world economy because oil prices would shoot up, and it would be damaging for Ukraine because the US and Europe would be distracted. It'd be bad. And so the U.S. Is embracing Israel, supporting Israel. President Biden went to Israel, but also saying, don't go too far. Limit the casualties, limit the war aims. Don't get into a larger war in the Middle East. So it's quite serious, but I think Israel has every right to defend itself. Remember, this was not a spontaneous uprising by Palestinian people. The Hamas constitution, its charter says that its purpose is to kill Jewish people and destroy the state of Israel. This is not a group you can negotiate with. It's a terrorist group. And so Israel calling for diplomacy and ceasefire is a little bit naive because of the nature of Hamas. They have to go and they have to destroy Hamas's warfighting capability as much as they can. And then they have to get out and contain the conflict as best they can.
Look at the reaction of the people in Israel. That reminds me that kind of reaction after 9/11. They're so angry, the people so sad, and after that, the United States go to war in Iraq. It's considered to be a mistake. So do you think the same kind of mistake can be happen in the future for Israel?
I don't think it's a mistake to go into Gaza and destroy Hamas as a threat. Israel has to do that.
Absolutely.
That's not a mistake. It would be a mistake to try to occupy Gaza. It would be a mistake not careful about collateral casualties. There will be casualties because Hamas uses civilians as shields. But so there are mistakes that Israel could make that would potentially widen the war, that would be bad for Israel, bad for the US, bad for the Palestinian people.
But after Hamas, do you think the Palestinian people in Gaza can find out another political power after Hamas?
Well, it'll be a vacuum.
Okay.
It'll be a vacuum, and people will be traumatized, and there will be casualties, and there will be much damage to repair and recover.
So the worst case scenario you mentioned was, the Israel stays Gaza longer and occupy Gaza, and another front is broke up in the northern front, and Iran and other countries get involved. That could be the worst case scenario.
It could be the worst case scenario, and the problem is that Bibi Netanyahu, the leader of Israel, he presented himself as the best leader for Israeli security, and the voters believed that. And he put together a coalition, but he put together a coalition with very extreme right-wing elements, and he distracted the country with big constitutional debates, political debates. And as a result, Israel was not ready. And 80% of Israelis want Netanyahu out after the war. So the thing that worries me is that Netanyahu won't go, or he will try to keep his power, and he'll be desperate, so he might make wrong decisions. Even though 80% of Israelis want him out of office as soon as the strike on Hamas is over. So we're not talking about Winston Churchill or a respected world leader. This is someone who's quite damaged in Israeli politics and not respected overseas, and that's a weak point. The other worrying thing is the Israelis were surprised, and usually Israel, in the Yom Kippur War, Israel was surprised, but within 48 hours they were counterattacking. But this time the Israelis were really surprised, and they're struggling in some ways, and so that might encourage Hezbollah or Iran to be even more aggressive. And make no mistake, this is not a Palestine-Israel thing alone. It is an Iran geopolitical struggle for dominance in the Gulf and the Middle East, and Iran had a heavy role in this attack by Hamas, arming them, and probably planning and playing some role. I think we will find out in the attack.
So if the Prime Minister Netanyahu tried to stay in power after the situation stabilizes, that could be the Prime Minister himself could be a risk.
It could be a risk. I think so. So it's very challenging for President Biden and other world leaders because they want to support Israel strongly, and so they have to support the Prime Minister, but they don't want him to stay, and neither do the Israeli people. But since he's in charge, he may try to stay. So there's some risk factors. The Hezbollah risk factor, that, as you pointed out, the danger of urban warfare in Gaza, Bibi Netanyahu's political situation, and then the overall world situation where you have the Ukraine war, you have North Korea and Russia developing a weapons alliance, you have growing tension in the South China Sea, and so that overall world situation may give some encouragement to Hamas or Iran or North Korea that they can take more risks. So it's a very unsettling time in world politics.
It is said that this is one of the biggest intelligence failure. No one can predict this can happen. So that for the Israeli intelligence community has such a strong such a strong intelligence community, but actually they couldn't do nothing. And at the same time, the United States intelligence community did not. It seems that they didn't give enough information for Israel. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I don't think the U.S. withheld intelligence from Israel, but there was an intelligence failure, and we don't see the intelligence, so we don't know exactly what the failure was. And even I think the government in Israel or the U.S. will take some time to understand exactly where the failure was. I remember after 9/11, we knew there was an intelligence failure, but they had to have a 9/11 commission do I think it was a year of investigation to find out exactly where was the failure. People are speculating, though, that there were two big failures for Israel and the U.S. and others in this. But for Israel, the big failures were, number one, Netanyahu's domestic political agenda divided Israeli society, and the intelligence services, Mossad, and the Israeli Defense Force were quite split. Yeah. And many of them were opposed to what Netanyahu was doing to the Constitution of Israel, so they were distracted politically. That was bad. But the other thing we may find is that Israel became too confident in technology. So the wall they built to seal off Gaza had very high-tech sensors and surveillance backed by satellites and AI, and Hamas and Iran evaded that, and the Israeli human intelligence, people on the ground, old-fashioned intelligence, proved insufficient to catch them because they had so much confidence in the technology. So I think for every country, it's a warning that old-fashioned intelligence, human intelligence, spies, analysis, cooperating with other allies on information sharing, those are still really important. AI, sensors, satellites, quantum, all these technologies, they are not a magic solution. No. I suspect that Hamas and their Iranian supporters were meeting in caves using paper, not communications like telephone or email, and that they were moving things in a very clever way to evade even the most advanced technologies.
It's kind of complacency, obviously.
Or overconfidence in the technology, yeah. It's like the French with the Maginot Line in World War II. They were, after World War I, the French, in the trench warfare, they built this incredibly high-tech fortress, and the Germans just went around it. It's a little bit like the Maginot Line, but we make those mistakes.